the overwatering trap that's silently killing your plants. Most gardeners don't kill their plants by neglect, they kill them with kindness, more specifically with water. I've seen it over and over again, lush, promising plants that suddenly stall, yellow, collapse and die, all while the grower insists they've been taking really good care of them. What they actually did was drown the roots. And once that happens, recovery is a race most plants lose. Overwatering is not just too much water. That's the beginner definition. The real issue is oxygen starvation in the root zone. Roots don't just drink water, they breathe. When soil stays constantly wet, the air pockets collapse, oxygen levels drop, and roots suffocate. Once that process starts, opportunistic pathogens move in, and what you're left with is rot, not growth. Most people don't realize how easy it is to fall into this trap because the signs of overwatering look deceptively similar to underwatering. Leaves droop, growth slows, plants look stressed. So what do people do? They add more water. That's the trap. And it's why I say overwatering is a silent killer. It convinces you to double down on the exact thing that's causing the problem. The first real shift you need to make is understanding moisture, not just watering. And this is where something simple like a soil moisture meter changes the game completely. I use one consistently across raised beds, containers, and even when calibrating hydroponic substrates, it removes the guesswork. Instead of poking the soil or relying on a watering schedule, you get a direct reading of what's actually happening below the surface. I'll link it in the description below. Once you start measuring instead of guessing, your entire approach to watering changes. What most gardeners don't realize is that soil type plays a massive role in how water behaves. In a sandy soil, water drains quickly, so overwatering usually comes from frequency rather than volume. In clay-heavy soil, the problem is the opposite. Water lingers, sometimes for days, creating a constant low-oxygen environment. If you're working with raised beds and using a typical compost-heavy mix, you're somewhere in between. But even then, compaction over time can turn a well-draining bed into a waterlogged one. I've tested this in multiple garden setups, and one pattern always shows up. The top layer of soil dries out faster than the root zone below, so if you're watering based on what the surface looks like, you're almost always watering too soon. That top inch can feel dry while the next 4 inches are still saturated. This is exactly why experienced growers stop trusting surface cues and start checking deeper. A moisture meter pushed down to root level gives you a much clearer picture than your fingers ever will. Now let's talk about containers, because this is where overwatering does the most damage. In a pot, there's nowhere for excess water to go except out the drainage holes, and if your soil mix is even slightly off, drainage slows down dramatically. I've seen people water container tomatoes every single day because they think pots dry out quickly. In reality, they're keeping the lower half of that container constantly soaked. The roots never get a chance to breathe. A better approach is to water deeply but less frequently. When you water, you want to saturate the entire root zone, then allow it to partially dry before the next cycle. That drying phase is not neglect, it's essential. It's when roots expand, searching for moisture, building stronger systems. If the soil is always wet, roots stay shallow and weak, and the plant becomes more dependent on constant watering. In hydroponic systems, the principle is the same, even though the setup is different. People assume that because roots are in water, oxygen doesn't matter. That's completely wrong. In systems like deep water culture, the entire success of the plant depends on oxygenation. Without proper aeration, roots suffocate just as quickly as they do in soil. That's why air stones and circulation are non-negotiable. Overwatering in hydroponics isn't about volume, it's about oxygen levels in the solution. Back in soil gardens, one of the biggest mistakes I see is rigid watering schedules. Watering every morning at 7 a.m. sounds disciplined, But plants don't operate on a clock. They respond to conditions. Temperature, humidity, wind, plant size, and soil composition all affect how quickly water is used. A fixed schedule ignores all of that. It's far better to water based on actual need. And again, this is where tools like a moisture meter give you an advantage. Instead of guessing or sticking to a routine, you respond to real conditions. Another factor that gets overlooked is mulch. Proper mulching can reduce watering frequency significantly by slowing evaporation and stabilizing soil temperature. But here's the catch. If you're overwatering, mulch can actually make the problem worse by trapping excess moisture in the soil. I've seen beds covered in thick mulch layers, where the soil underneath stays wet for days longer than it should. Mulch is a powerful tool, but it has to be used in balance with proper watering practices. Let's get practical. In a typical raised bed with a mix of compost, topsoil, and organic matter, you should be watering deeply enough to reach about 6 to 8 inches down. After that, you wait. Depending on weather conditions, that could mean watering every 3 to 5 days, sometimes longer. The key is not the number of days, it's the moisture level at root depth. If your meter reads in the moist range, you wait. If it drops toward dry, then you water again. In containers, the interval might be shorter, especially in hot conditions. But the principle stays the same. You water thoroughly, then let the soil partially dry. Not bone dry, not soggy. Somewhere in between. That balance is where healthy root systems develop. One thing I've learned from years of growing is that plants are far more tolerant of slight underwatering than they are of overwatering. A plant that gets a bit too dry will show stress quickly, but it usually recovers fast once watered. A plant that's been sitting in waterlogged soil for days doesn't bounce back easily. Root damage takes time to repair, if it can be repaired at all. Another subtle sign of overwatering is slow growth without obvious wilting. The plant just sits there, not thriving, not dying, but clearly not progressing. Leaves may turn pale, sometimes slightly yellow, especially on lower growth. This is often mistaken for nutrient deficiency, leading people to add fertilizer, which only compounds the problem. The issue isn't lack of nutrients, it's that the roots can't absorb them in a low-oxygen environment. This is where consistent monitoring makes a difference. When I'm managing multiple beds or experimenting with different soil mixes, I rely heavily on moisture readings to understand how each setup behaves. Even 2 beds side by side can hold water differently depending on how they were filled, how compacted they are, and what's growing in them. The moisture meter becomes less of a gadget and more of a diagnostic tool. If you're serious about improving your results, you need to start thinking of watering as a controlled input, not a routine chore. It's one of the most powerful levers you have in plant health, and it's also one of the easiest to get wrong. Most of the time, better results don't come from adding more. They come from holding back at the right moments. And here's the part that surprises people. Once you dial in your watering, everything else becomes easier. Nutrient uptake improves, root systems expand, plants become more resilient to heat and stress, even pest and disease pressure can decrease because you're no longer creating the damp conditions many pathogens thrive in. So if your plants have been struggling and you've been doing everything right, take a hard look at your watering habits. Not how often you water, but how much and why. Stop guessing, start measuring. Pay attention to what's happening below the surface, not just what you see on top. If you found this useful, subscribe and share this with someone who's still stuck in the cycle of overwatering without realizing it. Better gardening isn't about doing more, it's about doing the right things at the right time. And something as simple as a soil moisture meter can be the difference between plants that survive and plants that actually thrive.